Thank you for tuning in to the second episode of the history of the family business, the Schultz family business, the floral business that goes over 100 years. And this is the second episode, which is entitled The Second Generation. Just to recap a little bit, I'm Erick with Floral Wedding and Event Design. That's my business here in Southern California. And I felt it was be kind of fun to recap and go over the history of our business. In our first episode, I primarily talked about my grandfather and how he got his start in the early 1900s in Detroit area. Worked for a company called WWII, which the gentleman who owned the building that they worked in Detroit was at one time a mayor of Detroit, the 44th mayor of Detroit. And he also was a part of the organization of FTD. So again, my grandfather had this opportunity at a young age. We're looking probably around 1918, 1920, working for Mr. Breitmeyer and having that rich beginning of the floral business. And shortly after, he would move to Troy, Michigan, which was about 20, 30 minutes north of Detroit. And he would begin his business there. As I shared, family had a home in the back of the flower shop where they lived in, and that was all that was on the property at one time, just the home. And then they built the building, and they did this with their own bare hands. Amazing story, and I shared a little bit about that in the first episode. So I'm going to do a little bit different as far as showing pictures. Last time in the video, I went ahead and added them in with the program I have, but I thought it would be a little bit better to be able to comment on the pictures. And so I'm going to be showing them to you and then talking about it as we go. Hopefully it'll be clear enough for you. But again, the first flower shop, Maple Lane, I made a faux pas on the name. The name was Maple Lane Florist. And again, that was the name of the business. I didn't make a mistake on the name. I made a mistake on the street. And but Maple Lane Florist is the name of the first business that was built in Troy, Michigan. And that building, which is a combination of the building and the greenhouse you see, was built by my grandfather and my father and both sisters and my grandmother. So they were determined. And that, as I shared with you, that is still standing today. That building, of course, renovated a couple times, but some of the same foundation, the same bricks are still there today. And I'll cover that more in the third edition or the third episode of the third generation and how we still are in the flower business after 100 years. Also, another picture of that, which I thought was pretty good. That's a good close-up of the building. And notice the clock on top. That was very fashionable. And how smart was that of my grandfather? Big letters, Florist. You can't miss that from the street. And that was the best form of letting people know we were around by getting the word out. Another picture there of the sign, Maple Lane Florist. And again, these pictures were taken back in the 50s and 60s. The business was built in 1948, which is just at the close of World War II. So you can imagine the war had finished, and though everybody was just celebratory with the victory that we had, but so much of the resources and efforts. Even I remember hearing a story of my grandmother. She was a riveter. And she would rivet the planes during World War II, preparing the planes for war. And so many resources went into the war that at this time they were having to replenish. Yes, they were happy they won the war, but things were not that in abundance. They were really challenging for many families and people who had lost loved ones in the war, and they were trying to rebuild because so much of the money and the effort went into the war. So a few pictures of my grandfather with one of his employees. That's them holding a standard mom there. Kind of a cool shot, a big smile on his face. And then another picture of him in his home, and that's him holding on a poinsettia. And there's a nice shot of him. And then this was one that you didn't see so well on the last episode. That was, now I'm not bragging, that's me. But the funny thing about it is I'm actually sitting on a potting bench in the original greenhouse. That's why I wanted to show you, not just to show a picture of me when I was a kid, but I was in this greenhouse and playing, as you could see there, sitting on the potter's bench, which was one of many in that greenhouse in Troy, the first flower shop. Okay, so I wanted to share a little bit about my grandfather, and my dad tells a lot of stories about him, but my dad had a nickname for my grandfather, and it was Hawkeyes. And the reason he called him Hawkeyes is because he said, your grandfather doesn't miss a thing, or the phrase was, doesn't miss a trick. And so even though grandfather, and I'll share this in a moment, had retired, he still went to the store quite often. Even in his late 70s, he'd walk into the store, and when grandpa was coming, we always got notice. And we were told, and my dad made sure all the employees knew, and even me when I was working for my dad at a young age, even 12, 13 years old, sweeping floors, cleaning flowers, making boxes and things like that, I was told to stay busy. Get your hands out of your pockets and grab a broom and look busy. If grandpa's there, you stay busy. Don't you stand around. You just keep busy, and as long as you're moving, he won't see anything. But if you get still and you lean up against a counter or you put your hand in your pocket, you're going to hear about it. So he was like that with everybody. As soon as he walked in the back door of the flower shop, everybody was head down and moving as quickly as they possibly could. And that's what he liked. He liked production. He liked work. He didn't like messing around at all. And this was even after he was retired, when my dad owned the flower shop. So a little bit about my grandfather. He was all serious with kids. It wasn't until later, when I was in my teens and I had a chance to chat with him when he was a lot more frail, that he kind of opened up to me a little bit and was really quite tender, sharing stories with me about my grandmother and how much he loved her and how attractive she was. He actually showed me one of those black and white pictures that you get, the 3 pictures that you get in the mall, in one of the booths you go. This was an old timer, and it was just black and white. He had it in his wallet, and it was pictures of grandma. And he was telling me, isn't she a good looking lady? Wasn't she beautiful? And that was probably the only, like I said, tender moment I had with him, because every other time when he walked in or he was around, you just kept busy, you kept moving, you didn't hang around very long. And he was all work and no play, at least to us kids and employees. But we found out later on he enjoyed a good time too. But so I wanted to share that with you a little bit about him. He was a hard worker. He was very honest, and he was, as I said before, he was a visionary. Nothing slowed him down. He made plans and he followed through. And it was great to see, though, as he got older and he did retire, that he did do a lot of vacationing with my grandmother. One of the neat stories was that he went to Acapulco, and even in his 70s, he did some parachuting. And there's a picture of him. There was a picture, I should say, on the office door. And it was an 8x10 on a frame that was on the office door. That was the only main office that we had for the flower shop in Clawson. And on the picture was this picture of a man just in the very center of it, and he was attached to a parachute. And then below it said Johnny Schultz, president, and he knew that picture was up there. So it was his kind of a sense of humor in joking about. I guess not taking himself too seriously. But what happened is that he, back to the original flower shop in Troy, that he decided it was time to expand. So he started a new flower shop in Clawson, Michigan. And that also was called Maple Lane Florist. And again, the street that the flower shop was on in Troy was called Maple Lane. So of course, it makes sense to name the flower shop after the name of the street, Maple Lane. Not hashtag Maple Lane. That's what we would do to try to draw your attention. But it made sense that people use the name of the street to help remind people of the name of the business. And so if you heard it was Maple Lane Florist, they'd immediately think, oh yeah, that must be on Maple Lane. and which was at that time, which still is the 15 Mile Road in Michigan, in Troy. So they decided to make the move, and they built the new store in Clawson, next to the library, across the street from the police station, I should say. And the new store was built in 1963. That actually is that was my birth year. And that's when that flower shop began. And so what happened was, and then here's a picture of the original, one of the first pictures. There's the sign, and that was actually a home that had been converted into a business right on the corner of Livernois and Roth, and that was in Clawson. And so what happened was my dad bought the store in Troy, and so he was running that store, and Grandpa started running with family the new store in Clawson. And then shortly after that, my dad decided to come, and evidently he started to run the business there in Clawson as well. Sold the Troy store to his younger sister, which became Della's Maple Lane Florist of Troy. And then he had a Maple Lane there in Michigan, and he would rent the building because the building was purchased by my grandfather. He rented the building from my grandfather. And that's how that transition took place. Michigan and Troy were probably 15, 20 minutes apart probably 15 minutes from the other flower shop. So here's another shot of the Maple Lane Florist. That was with a new awning. It must have been in fall because it's Midwest, and that was this was probably taken late 70s, I would think. And then here's my dad designing, using some white glads, looks like a funeral piece there, sporting that cool 70s, 80s mustache there. One of the trucks, Flint Florist Exchange, they would bring floral right to the door. Either we would order flowers and get it that way, or we would go down in Detroit and pick up floral there at Hills was one of the wholesale houses down there. Also in Troy, there was Dorian wholesale floral. Or this truck would just come up, and then we would pick off the truck if we needed something. But most of my dad's flowers came from Hills down in Detroit area. And you'd go down as early as 6 o'clock. And it's not unfamiliar here in California, Southern California. LA was the place that everybody would go down. I'm sure a lot of people still do, but it's not so necessary with a lot more wholesalers in the area. My wholesaler is about 20 minutes away, and I do almost all of my buying from them. Interesting thing about now into the second generation, how things change with flowers and design and thought. And my dad did a lot of volume in his business, sold a lot of flowers. And this was one idea that he had that I was pretty impressed with. It's simple, but nobody did it. Now, mind you, this picture is a picture of fresh flowers that were put out in the flower shop. And you could go up and take a one carnation, one stem of daisy palms. You could take a little bit of baby's breath. You could make your own bouquet and buy things by the stem. And his thought was, let's have something like a European garden or like a European flower shop where people can they may not have a lot of money. They may just want to spend a couple dollars maybe on a few floral, and they can do that. So he would call this the line. And every morning we would pull the flowers from the cooler and bring it out and set it up the line. And we do that every day. And people loved it because some people said, I just have a couple dollars. I want to get a little something to take home and put it in a bud vase or something like that. So, and then there were those who made their own large bouquet. Of course, we had available bouquets. He also had, here's another picture of that. He also had another design, or I should say strategy to sell. And it was, I thought this, again, that's in the 80s. And one of the things that he did is he made a plan for what floral arrangements would be available, a price plan and a specific container, what flowers and how many went into that container, what the design looked like. So you had like 1 through 15 different floral designs, and each one had its own recipe. They had a specific floral and specific count. And then anytime you came to his shop, you could get, I want a number 4, and it would have a tag on it, and it'd be the same price and the same container. And he liked that idea because he thought it was a way of him saving money. And his thoughts were the designer didn't have to, take 10 minutes to figure out what they were going to make next for the front cooler. He thought it out for them. So that would save time without them maybe wanting to be a little more creative and add a little of this and a little of that. Instead, it was like, nope, you're going to add 5 carnations, 3 daisy pomps, a little bit of beige breath that is going to be in a teacup or in a basket, and that's it, and put it out there. So he was kind of similar to my grandfather. Let's keep things rolling. We're selling volume. We're not trying to sell creativity. We're selling flowers and volume. So that was my dad's system, which I thought was pretty cool. Because it worked and it was very effective. And my dad did very well in the early 80s. He was one of the most successful businessmen in Clawson, and he was Man of the Year for Clawson back in the 80s, early 80s. Here's another designer. Remember, this is back in the 80s. Stuffed animals my dad had when Beanie Babies were popular. Oh my gosh, my dad had every Beanie Baby available for sale. This is kind of some artificial silk and artificial floral, and this was something that he had in one area. He had silk that we did, and artificial and fresh. He did a little bit of everything. And then here's something I found this picture. I thought this was pretty interesting. Notice the pampas grass. If you're a florist or you're a bride, pampas grass is very popular right now. A lot of it is being used in weddings, on archways and such. Now, reminding you, we think the pampas grass, it's the latest thing, right? This was 40 years ago. This picture was taken in June of 1980. And there you have pampas grass. I also had it in dark chocolate brown, which I thought was pretty interesting as well. So there you have it. With some of the pictures and such from my dad's store. He went on to purchase another flower shop called Flowers by Michelle, and that was named after his second wife. And they had all the floral done at the first flower shop, Maple Lane, I should say the Clawson shop, Maple Lane Florist of Clawson, and then they would ship out to Maple Lane to Flowers by Michelle, the floral arrangements that they needed to fill. And it was the same system. You'd have a system where you had so many arrangements in the cooler, and the person in the morning, the cashier, would come in. They'd look at what was missing from the day's business before. They'd put their order in. I needed number 5, number 7, number 3. And sure enough, a truck would come by in the morning because all the designers were in the first I keep saying the first, but Clawson's store, because that was my dad's store. Again, my Aunt Della was now running the Maple Lane Florist of Troy. And then my dad did open up one other flower shop. And by the way, that Flowers by Michelle was in Clawson as well. It was just about a mile or 2 away from Maple Lane Florist of Clawson, and it did great business. And the people thought it was 2 different flower shops, but it actually was the same one, just down the block. It was the funniest thing, and it did so well. My dad also had this flower shop called Tiffy's Flower Company, and this was a flower shop in Utica that was just a little tiny satellite shop, real small, had a few items. Nothing big, but it was small. And again, same idea. We would run floral arrangements out as we needed to fill the cooler, because it just needed one cashier in there to handle the business. So that is a little about Maple Lane Florist. Now, my Aunt Della, who purchased the first store, Troy, this was a picture of that. And you remember the first one that I showed you, the black and white. This now was the new store, new awning. But again, you can still see the same design, the same shape. They just changed the outside, added an awning. But this was, I believe, picture was taken probably in the early 80s. And then once again, it was changed again. And this was probably late 80s, early 90s. And again, this is the second generation, my Aunt Della running this store. And it is believed, I remember that it burned down once. I should say it had a fire. That would be the better way of putting it. And I think, if I remember correctly, lightning hit the sign and electricity went right through and started a fire on the inside. They did catch it. I remember the greenhouse smelling like just charred smoke for a long time. But it didn't. They caught it enough that it didn't burn down. But it was a lot of work needed to be done to make it, be able to be used again. Also, in regards to the floral business with the second generation, of course, you had my dad who had Maple Lane of Clawson, and then he branched out to Flowers by Michelle and Tiffy's Flower Company. My Aunt Della, the younger sister, had Maple Lane of Troy, and she ran that one. And then my my dad's eldest sister, Grace Ann, her and her husband John started their own business called Accent Florist. Now, they really did well. There's a beautiful building here. They ended up having 5 flower shops. Did very, very well, very successful. And here's just a beautiful cooler space that they had. Now, these pictures, again, were probably taken late 80s, early 90s, but they did very, very well in the business. So that was the second generation. Now, just to let you know, a little preliminary for the next episode, my dad had me, his son, and he had one daughter. My sister, and then my Aunt Della had 4 children, and then my Aunt Grace Ann had 5. So now we have a whole nother generation coming into the flower business that I'll share in the next episode. But I hope this has been interesting for you to see a little bit about our business and some of the ins and outs, and how a whole family could be involved in the flower business. And when there were holidays and there were busy times, it was everybody on deck. Everybody was doing something. I remember even when my grandfather was retired, my grandmother would be in there making corsages, and aunts and uncles would be in there making deliveries or doing floral design or waiting on a customer or taking an order. It was really a all-out family business. And so it's been great chatting with you. I hope you've enjoyed this. And again, we're going to go on to episode number 3 shortly with the third generation and what's happened currently with the flower business as of up to 2020. So have a great day. I wish you the best, and thank you so much for tuning in.